Okay, the first thing I want to do is just point out this interesting thing that you should be aware of, and that is that you can see the bones of these different animals. We have our human arm, we have a dog foreleg, and we have seal flipper. And you'll notice that the bones have been color-coded to help identify them. So we have like the humerus in blue and the tibia and the fibia in red and green, or the humerus, excuse me. And you'll see the metacarpals and carpals and things like that. But that's not the important thing that I'm trying to point out. What I'm trying to point out is that the bones are the same among all these drastically different species. And so we call these homologous structures. So they have evolved from the same and then just took on different roles. And so if you were just to be a designer, for instance, and you were going to build a seal from scratch, you probably wouldn't bother with making a hand become a flipper. You would just make a paddle outright. So again, this is some of the stuff that demonstrates that we shared a common relationship and origin with these different animals. So it doesn't take much to modify these bones. You can change just a little bit in the genetics, and the bone grows a little bit longer or not. And then it just adapts to the particular environment. We even see this in embryos. Can you name that embryo? Yeah, so all these different embryos have gills. They all have tailbones. And voila, one is a fish, one is a reptile, one is a bird, and one is a human. Now, obviously, the embryo goes on and gets rid of the gills and becomes a fetus and all that kind of stuff, while the fish continues to keep its gills. But again, it shows that relationship that we have among all these different animals and species. In fact, the way we look at evolution, everything is related to everything else at some level. Now, even if someone has, takes exception to that and says, well, we didn't evolve from monkeys or something like that as a way of ridiculing evolution. As a scientist, I would say, yeah, we didn't evolve from monkeys. We shared a common ancestry, a relationship. And I'm not sure why that's such a big deal, because if they were religious or supernatural, you could just argue that it's a common plan coming from the same source, and that as a scientist, just refer to it as evolution. But again, I'm hoping people don't dismiss evolution because of whatever backgrounds they come from. I want them to realize that evolution is an incredibly important tool to biologists, and even important in your own lives. If you take an antibiotic, for instance, and you kill off 80% of the bacteria in your body, and then you say, hey, I feel great, I'm not going to take any more antibiotics, what's left over? It's the bacteria that had some resistance to the antibiotic. And then who gets it on and reproduces, either asexually or sexually? The ones that are resistant to the antibiotic. And the next population will have that resistance. Evolution takes place in a population and not in an individual. But again, anatomy and physiology, or any biology class you take, can demonstrate evolution at some level, or all levels, because the idea is evolution helps us to make sense of why do these different species look similar to one another, embryologically, speaking, or the bones and things of that nature. Now, I wanted to talk to you mostly about the circulatory system today. And we might not get through the whole thing, but let's go ahead and start talking about the circulatory system. Now, do all animals have a circulatory system? Almost all animals do. Well, a big percentage do, but there are some animals that don't have a circulatory system. and some that have what we call an open circulatory system. So an example of an animal that does not have a circulatory system would be a sponge. SpongeBob SquarePants. Well, sponges live in the ocean, and they don't have a circulatory system. They are the simplest animals. They don't even have symmetry. But you begin to start seeing some circulatory systems of sorts in insects. Some have no circulatory system, some do. And then we get to what we have, which is called a closed circulatory system, where the blood is traveling around in vessels. And so a circulatory system is important, particularly when it's mirrored up with a cardiovascular system. So in the case of animals like us, humans, we would have a cardiovascular system that would take in oxygen with the lungs or nutrients with the intestinal tract, and then move it along through these closed circulatory systems, through these arteries and veins and capillaries and so forth. The cardiovascular system and the circulatory system is important. It helps to get rid of waste. So all sorts of cells produce waste. Every cell will break down sugar or proteins or whatever and make waste. And then that waste goes into your bloodstream, as in the blood plasma. And then it might get filtered in the kidneys or the liver. Hormones move throughout your body. So there'll be certain cells that'll make the hormones. And then those hormones will travel through the blood through the tissues to the target cells. Heat is also dissipated and used by the circulatory system. So you have, when you're making heat from your muscles, that'll help. The circulatory system might help move it around, but it also helps to dissipate it from your body. If it's really hot outside, your blood vessels are going to dilate and help you to get rid of that extra heat. If it's cold, everything's going to constrict and help conserve that cold, or that heat, excuse me. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of muscles. And when you do use up sugars to make up energy, ATP is the byproduct of breaking down sugars through the mitochondria. That carbon dioxide is delivered into your bloodstream as biocarbonate, and then travels through your blood to your lungs, where you get rid of that carbon dioxide. In fact, if you were in a room, sealed, an airtight room, you would begin to start to breathe faster. What caused you to breathe faster wasn't the lack of oxygen, it was actually the buildup of carbon dioxide. Your body responds to a buildup of carbon dioxide and causing you to breathe at a faster rate. It's kind of a crazy story, but just to give you kind of an illustration of that, I was in doing I was a mosquito fighter down in St. Louis County, and we would use this dry ice to attract mosquitoes, because when you breathe out, the mosquitoes can pick up on your carbon dioxide in your air and follow you. Actually, it's only the females that bite you, because they need a blood meal for their eggs. So I would trap mosquitoes by having a cage with some dry ice, and I would suck in the mosquitoes through a fan into a net. And then I'd freeze the mosquitoes because I wanted to test them for viruses and things like that. And so what happened was I would go around St. Louis County collecting mosquitoes. It was a really hot day, and I was afraid the dry ice would melt out or disappear, or just boil off. So I put it into this hotel room with me. And my brother just happened to be visiting me because I got to work by myself, basically. And the next day, the cooler was just open a little bit next to his head. And I woke up and he was like, so I almost killed my brother. But the cool thing is I shut it and opened up the doors and windows. And in fact, you kind of can think of me as a hero. I saved his life. So I saved my brother's life. Almost killed him, but saved his life at the same time. So it kind of balances out, I suppose. But nobody gave me a medal, just put it that way. But anyway, the circulatory system, especially the closed circulatory system, is pumped around by the heart through all sorts of conduits that are called blood vessels. Again, the simplest animals don't have much of a circulatory system of any. but they're so flat and small, like a flatworm, that they can basically just do the gas exchange directly with the environment. And so they have what you call a highly vascularized area or flattened area called a gastrovascular cavity. And it provides a huge amount of surface area for this gas exchange. So this is how aquatic animals get away without a closed circulatory system. They just have a very flattened body called a gastrovascular cavity, and it's enough to get the gas exchange to take place. The large animals like yourself and many layers of cells need this closed circulatory system, or in some cases, an open circulatory system. Here's an example of an open circulatory system. This is found in insects, for instance, or mollusks. And so the insect basically is just a sac full of blood. They call it hemosyl or hemolymph. It's in the hemosyls where it's stored, and the hemolymph is the blood. And they don't really have blood cells like we do. I mean, they do have some blood cells, but most of their gas exchange takes place through air tubes called trachea. But the blood still circulates around, and it's done so with a tubular heart. So there's a heart on the dorsal side. So our heart's on the ventral side. Their heart is actually on the back side, the dorsal side. And so that heart helps to pump the blood throughout the body. And so that is an open circulatory system because there's no closed vessels like veins and arteries that contain it. While mollusks also have an open circulatory system as well. So here you can see a heart pumping blood around, but for the most part, the blood is flowing around the tissues directly. So again, that's what we see in an open circulatory system. The blood can mostly move pretty freely throughout the animal's body cavity. But again, they do also have a heart. Mollusks include things like squid and octopus and mussels and things like that. We start to see our first closed circulatory system in simple animals like earthworms. You'll see that they have some hearts up at the front that pump blood through something that's a little bit like an artery or veins, and actually will go through a capillary bed. The capillary bed is where the gas exchanges will take place or pick up the waste particles. So again, the first time we really see a closed circulatory system are on animals like earthworms. Again, the advantages of a closed circulatory system is it more rapidly provides nutrients, like from your, whether it be from your digestive system or to get rid of waste, like through the kidneys or through your lungs, depending on what type of waste you're getting rid of. If it's carbon dioxide, it's obviously from your lungs. If it's the breakdown of proteins into urea, it's obviously going to be from your kidneys. Your kidneys basically filter your blood plasma. Closed circulatory systems are better for animals with a high metabolic need. Warm-blooded animals is what you would call them casually. They're endothermic is another term, but these are animals like ourselves that keep our body temperature regulated that isn't directly related to the environment. Insects get away with it because they're so small. They can have an open circulatory system, and they're also what they call ectothermic. They're cold-blooded animals. So they don't, for the most part, so they don't need all that stuff, and they don't need all the gas exchange because they're so small also. So again, where you see a lot of very strong closed circulatory system are animals such as vertebrates. These are animals with backbones. And it can vary quite a bit. If it's a fish, they might have a 2-chambered heart. If it's a human, it's going to be a 4-chambered heart. The chambers are things like atriums and ventricles, and I'll show you a picture of that as well. There's also 2 circuits for the more complicated animals like ourselves. We have a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit is our lung circuit. So blood will be pumped from the left side of the heart from the left ventricle. You'll see a picture of this in a moment. From the left ventricle into the lungs, and then from the lungs it goes back to the heart on the left side. So actually the left side of the heart is actually thicker and bigger and stronger than the right side of the heart, because the left side of the heart pumps the blood through the rest of the body, the systemic portion of the body. And we call that the body circuit. So again, looking at some circulatory systems of different animals. Here are fish. Again, they have a closed circulatory system, but they only have a two-chambered heart. They have an atrium and a ventricle, and then that blood travels to the gills, and then through the aorta it goes to the systemic capillaries, where it goes to the body of the fish, the muscles of the fish, where it provides the nutrients or whatever organ, and then the blood returns back to the atrium, and then back to the ventricle, and then back to the gills again. The blue means the blood is deoxygenated, and red means the blood has oxygen in it. We haven't got to it yet, but hemoglobin is a protein found in red blood cells that holds the oxygen. I'll show you pictures of that later. But hemoglobin is the protein found in your blood cells. In fact, each one of your red blood cells might have a million hemoglobin molecules. When the hemoglobin is finally broken down, it's made into bile salts that help with digestion. And it also is what makes when it is finally liberated from your body, this is what gives your urine its gold color. It's the breakdown of these hemoglobins. Now, obviously, your urine can turn bright yellow if you take a lot of vitamin B or something like that. If you have a lot of water in your system, you've been drinking a lot of water, your urine is obviously less yellow, but it's still got a little bit of yellow in it, and that's due to the bile that's present. What your kidneys are doing is filtering your blood. Now, you start to see the evolution of the circulatory system when you look at lungfish. Lungfish have something that looks like a three-chambered heart. You have your two atriums, and you have a ventricle. That's a lot like an amphibian's heart. So this is one of the reasons we have evidence to think about how animals may have evolved and walked onto land. It'd be through animals like this lungfish. Even though the African lungfish is a modern, comparatively speaking, to some of the first animals that walked on land that are no longer with us. But again, they have a three-chambered heart, a lot like an amphibian. They have gills and they have lungs. And then the blood travels through those. So they have a little bit of a pulmonary system where some of the deoxygenated blood goes through the lungs, goes through the gills and the lungs, and then back to the heart. So that would be the pulmonary circuit. And then some of it goes through the systemic circuit, but there's no clear deviation in the three-chambered heart. Here's another example of a three-chambered heart. You can see it starting to form into a four-chambered heart, where you got the two top upper chambers are smaller. There's a right atrium and a left atrium. And then the ventricles, you'll notice, is not completely separated. So it's still considered a single ventricle. So the blood comes in from the body through the right atrium, then it's squirted into the ventricle, and then the ventricle squirts it out to the body and to the lungs. So it goes both directions. So you can see that the blood is not perfectly oxygenated. That's why they give it a purple color. And so red and blue kind of makes a purple color. This is not very efficient, but if you're a frog with a very slow metabolism and you're cold-blooded, then you can get away with a circulatory system that is not highly efficient. You sit around a lot, you don't do a lot of metabolic needs compared to a mammal. Remember, a mammal is warm-blooded, has hair, has mammary glands for nursing, gives live birth, and so forth. we see that the heart becomes more, and the circulatory system becomes more differentiated into almost four complete chambers. Again, we still have the left atrium and the right atrium, but now the ventricles are becoming more left and right. There's still some gaps in it. And so there is still some blood that's being mixed, making it not as fully oxygenated as it could be. We see this in lizards and snakes as well as crocodiles. Well, actually, crocodiles, you start to see much more of a four-chambered heart. So our first true four-chambered heart is actually in crocodiles. So now we have a left aorta, a right aorta, a left ventricle, and a right ventricle. Now remember, the right side receives deoxygenated blood. So the body returns blood to the right atrium. The right atrium pumps blood into the right ventricle. Then it'll travel to the lungs where it gets oxygenated, travels to the left atrium, and then to the left ventricle, and then throughout the rest of the body. Remember, the left side, even if it's not shown in this picture, is actually thicker muscled than the right side. Birds and mammals also have a true four-chambered heart. Again, providing evidence that birds and mammals have evolved from that three-chambered heart that you saw in reptiles. So birds, or the idea is birds came from dinosaurs, and then humans also came from reptiles. Not just humans, but the ancestors that led to mammals. So there have been primitive, so a missing link would be a primitive reptile that may have given live birth, for instance. The scales of reptiles can turn into feathers just by little changes in the genes. But here we see a true four-chambered heart with a true cardio or pulmonary, I kept saying cardio, a true pulmonary circuit and a true systemic circuit. This gives you the relative amount of blood that travels around the body from these different chambers. This one is representing humans. And so let's look at the heart itself first. You can see the right atrium, and then right beneath it is the right ventricle. And then that blood is pumped to the lungs. Is everybody following that? Okay. That's the pulmonary arteries, because arteries are thicker and they are vessels that leave the heart. They travel to the lungs. They'll go through some thin capillaries, and then they will return through via the pulmonary veins to the left atrium. And then they'll travel to the left the left ventricle, the left side of the heart, and then travel systemically through the body. Now, if you look at the picture of the heart, do you notice that the left side is thicker than the right side? Again, that's because the muscles are more developed on the left side because they have to push harder to push the blood through the body than through the lungs. If you follow the arrows and you leave the left ventricle, you'll see that it travels out to the head, the brain, the digestive system. You'll see there's all sorts of vessels. There's some that go to the kidneys through a set of, and every time you see those, you see the red break down into smaller little vessels. Those are capillaries. Does everybody understand that? So those are capillaries. This gives you the amount of blood that's traveling to the different parts of the body. So as the blood is traveling through the body, 0.7 liters out of 5 liters travels to the brain. So almost a liter, almost a fifth of the blood circulating your body, travels to your brain at any given pump of your heart. 0.2 liters goes to your heart, Your liver takes 1.35, so it takes more. Your kidneys are quite a bit smaller, but they take a lot of blood. Now think about your muscles. Your muscles are a huge amount of your body weight, aren't they? Yet it only takes a little bit over a liter. So your brain takes almost as much oxygenated blood as your whole body does, muscle-wise. Does that make sense? Your muscles, all your muscles use about the same amount of blood as your brain does, or your kidneys, out of the 5 liters. Your skin doesn't take that much, comparatively speaking, and that's huge again. Huge amount of your body and weight is due to skin. And your bones are a huge amount of weight, and they don't take that much blood either. So you see your body invests and puts most of the blood towards, relatively speaking, your brain, your kidneys, your liver, even your heart will get quite a bit in comparison to your body, relatively speaking, even though it's a muscle too. Now this is a picture of the heart. You have your right atrium and your left atrium. Those are the top of the hearts, and your heart's pointing a little bit towards your towards your left hip. So it's on a little bit on the left side, and the point, I believe we call that the apex, as I remember, points a little bit towards your left hip. Again, if you look at the heart, you'll see that the left side is thicker and more developed, and that's where, because again, it's going to pump the blood through the systemic system. So you have the aorta on top, you have your pulmonary arteries that travel to your lungs. Anything blood returning back to your heart are called veins. Blood leaving your heart are called arteries. Now it's generally thought that, oxygenated blood is always in your arteries. That's not always the case. In the systemic circulatory system, that's mostly the case, not always the case, but mostly the case. It can vary a little bit, whether it goes down the hepatic portal and stuff like that. So again, this is the basic anatomy of the heart. You should kind of become familiar with it. You'll notice that also on the heart, when you look at the atrium, there's these valves that open and close, and I'll show videos on it. And the lub dub is due to the valves closing. When the valves close and open, you'll hear the swish, close, swish, close. It's basically preventing the blood from going back into the atrium. So when the ventricle contracts, they will shut these valves. And I'll show you a picture of that. When the ventricles are relaxed, we call it diastole. And when the ventricles contract, we call it systole. And there may be better ways to pronounce it than that, but that's how I remember it. Anyway, this kind of shows you how the arteries and veins, the veins would normally be in blue unless it's going to the cardiac system. This means it's deoxygenated, but it basically goes through the capillaries of all these different organs. Let's take another look at the heart. And this one, I would want you to learn it a little bit, pay attention to it. Again, you can see the right atrium and the left atrium. You can see the left ventricle is the right ventricle is much thinner than the left ventricle. And then you can see what they call tricuspid valves. Do you see that all? Does everybody see that? It's right between the atrium and the ventricle. Do you see that? And then on the right side, we call them the bicuspid valves. Tricuspid means 3, bicuspid means 2. And again, those are the valves that will close when the heart contracts and the ventricle contracts. Now, if you remember from our muscle physiology class, the muscles of the cardiac muscles are kind of a combination of skeletal muscle and smooth muscle. They have striations. You all remember me talking about striations in here? Striations are made up of mostly of thick myosin. That's what gives it that appearance. If you remember how skeletal muscles contract, cardiac muscles contract a lot in a lot of the same ways. They also have intercalated discs that help hold the skeletal muscles together. So when the heart is pumping, they don't just pull apart or tear apart. So the muscles are held tightly together through these intercalated discs. Skeletal muscles have one nucleus. Excuse me, I say skeletal muscles. Cardiac muscles have only one nucleus. Skeletal muscles have lots of nuclei. Smooth muscles have one nucleus. So again, cardiac muscle is that somewhere in the middle. Has one nucleus, it has striations, it has these intercalated discs that help hold it together. The contraction is somewhere in the middle between skeletal muscle, which is very rapid, smooth muscle is very slow, and again, cardiac muscle is somewhere in the middle. This here is a graph that is not much different than what you learned when you studied skeletal muscles. This is excitation, contraction, coupling again, but this time it's in cardiac muscle. Do you remember excitation, contraction, coupling to some degree when we talked about it in skeletal muscles or smooth muscles? We have this depolarization that travels down a T-tubule, and then it goes to the sarcoplasmic reticulum, releasing calcium, just like we saw before in skeletal muscle. That calcium will attach to troponin, move the tropomyosin out of the way, allowing the myosin to grab onto the actin and start pulling using ATP. Do you remember that a little bit from skeletal muscles? And after the contraction takes place, the calcium returns to the sarcoplasmic reticulum through the use of ATP, or pumped out of the body through these pumps that are found on the cell membrane using ATP again. But generally, this is, in speaking, is what happens with excitation, contraction, coupling, and skeletal muscle. So just following along, as you look at number one and you see the red, action potentials enters from the cell. This might be through a neuron of some sort, or it may be from adjacent cells. That sodium comes in. That's what it means. That's depolarization. So sodium travels down the cell membrane, opening up sodium channels down the membrane until it reaches the voltage-gated calcium channel, which opens up on the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So calcium's coming, so there's a little bit of difference here. Calcium's coming in through a voltage-gated channel from the outside, so there's extracellular calcium. That's what's shown up at the top. That'll come in as well as calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So calcium induces calcium release from the rhodin receptor channels, RYR. We see this bunch of calcium momentarily, and we call that a calcium spark. Again, the calcium will attach to the troponin that moves the tropomyosin out of the way so that the myosin can grab onto the actin and cause the contraction to take place with ATP. Once the muscle relaxes, the calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or it's exchanged outside where the sodium comes in and the calcium goes out. And then the sodium goes out and the potassium comes back in through a sodium-potassium pump. Again, that requires ATP to do so. So does everybody kind of understand what's happening here? Yes. Yes. So sodium's coming in. Calcium comes in. That's a little different than skeletal muscle. Remember, calcium is only in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And now calcium is also coming in from the T tubules. So it's a little different in that regard. And then when the muscles relax, the calcium goes back into the saccharomyces reticulum using an ATPase, or the calcium is pumped back out. And the sodium comes back in, sodium is pumped back out, and potassium comes back in. So then we have that huge amount of sodium out here again, extracellularly. Because remember, even at rest, the outside of the cell is more positive. Give me a second. Okay, so now we're going to look at the heart a little bit more and talk about the fact that the heart can actually contract on its own. It does receive inputs from your brain and nervous system, of course, and so forth, and the aorta and all that kind of stuff. But the heart also can contract on its own. So here's a picture of heart muscles, and you can see the intercalated disc here. And then you can see that there's a group of cells, and in this particular case, called the sinoatrial node, SA node for short. And what it does is it can send electrical chemical stimulus through the heart muscle cells and actually trigger a heart contraction without a brain or nervous system. So like they showed at Indiana Jones or whatever, if the heart was pulled out, it would continue to contract. And so the electrical stimulus would travel through the heart, through the sinoatrial node. And how it does so is through what they call leaking membrane, which would allow sodium to come in, or so forth. And we can get into that a little bit later. But then that stimulus will cause a depolarization spontaneously. And then that depolarization travels through these cells. These cells not only have the intercalated disc, but they also have what they call gap junctions, which are like doors between cells that allows the electrical signal to travel from one heart muscle cell to the other. And again, these are through cations and calcium and stuff like that. And so the signal will travel and it'll cause the heart to begin to contract. So electrical stimulus will come through and then the heart will contract. And so if you look at this picture, you can see the electrical stimulus happen followed by the heart contraction. And the depolarization travels down the membrane. And like you go back to that previous picture, the excitation contraction coupling takes place, as I had shown you in the previous picture. I'll come back to that in a moment. So let's look at this pacemaker cells again. We have again, that's another word for these cells that trigger the heart contraction. One was, again, the SA node, or also known as the sinoatrial node. In this case, it's shown as a little orange dot at the top of the right atrium. There, electrical stimuli comes across and leaves that group of cells, causing the adjacent cells to depolarize and contract. Again, that's going through the gap junctions, as I showed you in the previous picture. And then reaches the thing that we call the Atroventricular Node, or AV node. And that's shown here. Let me go back and show you. That's the AV node. So this is the SA node. This is the AV node. These are the atriums. Remember, that's the parts of the heart that receive blood. And the blood is received. And then the contraction will take place first here and then squirted into the blood will be squirted into the ventricles, then the ventricles will contract. So the yellow represents the electrical stimulus that travels through the heart. And then it'll travel down these AV nodes to the ventricles. And then that'll cause the ventricles to contract. So the atriums will contract first, followed by the ventricles. That's the lub-dub when you got the two heart contractions. And again, the sounds will be from these ventricles closing. So if you can look at the picture again, you'll see that the top picture, the heart's relaxed. The SA node releases electrical stimulus. That's the yellow color that's traveling across. It'll reach the AV node, and then the electrical stimulus will travel down these things called Purkinje fibers and cause the ventricles to contract. And you'll notice that the flaps that are shown between the atrium or the atricles, excuse me, the atriums and the ventricles will close. And so if you look at the ventricular contraction on the right side, you'll see that it's closed when the ventricles contract. When they contract, the blood will travel to the pulmonary system and then also through the systemic circulatory system. We call these cells that are able to electrically discharge on their own pacemaker cells. And so when the vice president of Dick Cheney, he would get a pacemaker replacement every now and then. So people that get pacemaker replacements, they're basically getting some batteries volted in to their heart to give this electrical discharge. Obviously, it's more complicated than it, but that's the gist of it. So when their Dara cells run out, they have to get another. I shouldn't laugh because I hope someday I don't have to have it. But you know what I'm saying? I've done surgeries where I remove the hearts from frogs or turtles, and the hearts will beat all day long as you keep them moist and give them a little nutrients. Maybe you could put these hearts into a little fishbowl and they'll swim around, and you can just keep feeding them sugar and ATP. But anyway, this is a normal heart contraction. The SA node will contract, will release an electrical discharge that will travel across the atriums. The atriums will contract while the electrical charge travels down the Purkinje fibers and then cause the ventricles to contract. Why is the Purkinje fibers important? Well, that's to help get the whole ventricle to contract at the same time. Imagine if you had a tube of toothpaste and you only caused the top part to contract. Then that would be inefficient. That would have a lot of toothpaste still at the bottom. So if you wanted to get it all out, you want to push the whole thing at once, that tube, right? To get the whole thing to squirt out. Now, sometimes hearts go into defibrillation, and that's when the electrical discharge doesn't work really well. And so that's the whole point of getting those pads that you see on the wall, and they say clear. They're shocking the heart to stop it momentarily. And then the SA node will contract, will send electrical discharge and get the right one, the ventricles to contract and get it back into sync. So when you go through some heart attacks or some problems, that's when the heart is defibrillating. It's not contracting properly in sync because the electrical discharge isn't working. So if you stop the heart by giving it a shock over the whole thing will stop. And then eventually the atrium will contract and then the ventricle will contract in unison. Now it is true that your nerves coming down from your aorta, that monitor your blood. The aorta, remember, is one of the big vessels that monitors the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood. And some of that information travels to your brainstem and back and forth. This can control your heart rate. So some things will speed up a heart rate. If you're low on oxygen and high in carbon dioxide, your heart rate's going to increase. If you start exercising, your heart rate's going to increase. All this is being monitored by nerves and things that are monitoring your blood and things like that. So there's additional inputs going to your heart that will speed up a heart contraction. So here's the cardiac cycle again. This graph here shows the internodal pathways between the SA node and the AV node. So there's actually something kind of like nerves that goes between the SA node and the AV node, and is known as the internodal pathway, which is a lot like the Purkinje fibers, the bundle fibers. So again, if you watch the cardiac cycle and you go from A to B, the heart's relaxed. Then the SA node begins to give its electrical discharge, which is, I believe, sodium coming into the cells because it has a leaky membrane, or calcium, but it's going to be a positive cation. That's going to cause the atriums to contract. Initially, the purple that's going across the top of the heart from C to D, that's demonstrating the electrical discharge. And then you'll start to see that it's not really shown very well in this picture, but then right afterwards, the atriums will contract. At the same time, the electrical discharge will start traveling down from the AV node to the atroventricular node, down the Purkinje fibers, cause the ventricles to contract, and then ultimately pump the blood throughout the body. So this is showing you the electrical discharge as it travels through the heart. And then over here, this is showing you the contraction, where the atriums are in number 2 are contracting, pushing the blood into the ventricles. The ventricles contract, pushing the blood through the body. I think this picture here you'll like better, though. I think this one's the most clear. So if you look at the far left, where it says ventricular filling, you'll see that the right atrium is filled with blood and the left atrium is filled with blood. Now remember, the right atrium received blood from the entire body. So it's deoxygenated, and that's why it's colored blue. The left atrium has received blood from the lungs. So that's why it's colored red, representing oxygenation. You'll see a little bit of dripping going on into the ventricles. You have the electrical discharge, the atriums will contract, pushing the blood into the ventricles. Then the ventricles will begin to contract, closing the flaps so the blood doesn't go back into the atrium, and then pushes the blood through the body, either through the pulmonary circulatory system or the systemic circulatory system. And so that's just what more of these pictures show you. You can kind of read through them. I'll provide these PowerPoints to you. But anyhow, here you can see the blood traveling to the atriums, down to the ventricles. The ventricles contract, sending the blood through the aorta or the pulmonary tract. This is an EKG. So you can put the pads on your arms and legs if you ever did an EKG, and it will actually measure the electrical discharge from your heart right before your heart contraction. So during the diastole phase, this is what we know as the ventricles are relaxed. Now the atriums will begin to contract during the diastole phase. And then you'll see a little electrical discharge, and that's what the EKGs picked up, the millivolts. Then you'll see what they call the QRS cycle or whatever. That's the electrical discharge across the heart that can be monitored on your body. So when you see the beep, 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 beep in those movies before somebody dies, you know what I'm saying? It's classical, right? That is what you're looking at. You're looking at the electrical discharge across the heart. And so right before the QRS portion, that is the electrical discharge right before the ventricles contract. Does that make sense? And then the ventricles will contract And then you'll see the T and the P and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, if you're going to go to medical school, you'll study that a little more deeply, or nursing school, or whatever the case may be. So here's how somebody's set up for an EKG or an ECG. They got pads on their hands, and then it goes to the monitor. All right, so I think that's probably a good place to stop. And then we will continue here next time talking about how the atriums and the ventricles work. Anyway, thanks for your attention today.